Our next speaker is one of the nation's leading firearms historians and experts on gun culture in America. Ashley Hlebinsky is the former curator of the Cody Firearms Museum and a respected voice in both academic and policy circles. She has testified before Congress, advised museums and law enforcement, and works to bring a historical context to today's firearms debates. Please welcome Ashley Hlebinsky.
Thank you so much to G.O.A.L.S for asking me to speak. Now, I usually make the joke at this point that the reason someone would invite a historian to speak at an event like this is to give you an excuse to take a nap. But since 2022, my field has become quite dramatic. And that's because in 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on the Bruen decision, which completely changed the Second Amendment landscape, but it also thrust a part of history into the limelight completely. And that's basically because Bruen decided that history is one of the most, if not the most, important part to determining whether or not a firearms law is constitutional. And they created the Bruen test, which is basically just a hierarchy of important timeframes in history, starting with the founding era around the ratification of the Second Amendment and going all the way down to the least important part, which is the 20th century. And they're all trying to answer the specific question of, are there historical laws in the past that are similar enough to modern laws? And if they can argue that to the courts, then the law can be upheld. And if they can't, then it's considered unconstitutional. One of the bigger problems, though, for people who are gun control activists is that firearms laws that focus around features or technology, so magazine restrictions or quote-unquote assault weapons bans, those are all laws that started in the 20th century, so long after the founding era. And the courts ruled in Bruen that you didn't have to consider all of those subsequent timeframes. In fact, Bruen only looked at the founding era. So in order for a lawyer to argue that they want to include laws from different timeframes, they have to basically say several things, and I'm simplifying this, but one, they have to prove that the technology didn't exist, and if it did exist, was it prominent enough to be known? Because if it wasn't known, then you could make the argument, well, they didn't know about it, so why would they regulate it? The problem, though, is that all of these technologies have existed for a really long time. Repeating technology, for example, dates to the earliest firearm, the hand cannon. Magazine-fed firearms date to the 1600s in both military and civilian models. Pistol grips, forward grips, folding stocks, all of the features you hear with quote-unquote assault weapons bans, they've all been around for centuries. So it's really hard to argue that these things are new. And the other thing that's really interesting that not a lot of people realize is there are so many examples of this technology dating back to the 1400s in some examples. But I'm going to say, as a historian, there are some examples that are not as great. So I want to give you guys a couple of more examples that you can use as you're kind of having conversations with people about firearms and firearms history. So the ones that I don't love are the Belton repeating rifle and the puckle gun. Perhaps you've heard of them. It's basically the same as as talking to a historian as it is someone saying a clip is a magazine to you. And that's because the Belton in the 1750s was ultimately rejected, and the surviving examples are questionable in provenance. And the puckle gun, I'm not even going to get into it, but it's basically a very, very slow gun in comparison to things that did exist around the founding era. There is, though, a Belton that existed in the 1780s. So Joseph Belton partnered with a British gun maker, and they made the Belton Jover. And the Belton Jover was capable of firing in multiple modes, including one that was as fast as a modern semi-automatic. They also had detachable magazines, and they were ordered en masse. So where the Belton in America was not that successful or successful at all, there were hundreds ordered by the East India Trading Company. Instead of the puckle gun, I like to recommend the Chambers because it was actually made in America around the time of the founding era. There were multiple different types of Chambers guns, but one of them was capable of firing 224 rounds in succession with one trigger pull. Thomas Jefferson also knew about it, so that goes to the question of, did people know about it? In fact, he recommended a patent application for it. There were tests in front of Congress, and it was adopted for the War of 1812. When it comes to magazine-fed repeaters, we often talk about the Lorenzoni, but I like to say Lorenzoni style because there were so many people making that style around the world. You've got Kalthoffs, those are magazine-fed repeaters. Even the self-rotating revolver that we credit to Sam Colt, was invented 150 years before his patent. So basically, these things have been around for a really, really long time. But the one thing that I like to point out to people is, yes, the Bruen decision really helped people who support the Second Amendment, but it's not been a one-sided victory. In fact, since the Bruen decision, historians from universities all across America have been crawling out of the woodwork, and there have been so many more historians that are testifying against firearms rights. In fact, sometimes 5 or 6 experts against 1 or 2 of us. And the frustrating thing is, because they come from the university system, they automatically get this kind of level of credibility that they don't necessarily earn. I had one expert I worked against on a case who argued about magazine restrictions, and he used the example of a Sharps rifle as a 7-shot repeater. Well, if you don't know your history, it's a single shot, so it has absolutely nothing to do with this. But because he had a PhD, he was considered more credible of a witness. And this isn't an argument with historians whether or not we have different interpretations on the same fact. This is just plain wrong. And it's just very frustrating to see this lack of understanding, this lack of credibility, kind of being so pervasive in the university system. And because they have that degree, they're just automatically assumed to be right. So I'm going to take this last few minutes to just basically say that it is so important now, more than ever, to invest in real research, credible scholars. In fact, I actually started a research center with a colleague of mine at the University of Wyoming to try to put this information out there, because the reality is that history is for everyone. It doesn't have to be political, but it deserves to be told honestly. And you know what? I get it. History is not that sexy. It's not as exciting for a lot of people as other topics we talk about in this room. However, nap time is over, and it's time to wake up, because the courts have identified history as the battlefield. And if we continue to let those history professors write our history, they can take our rights with it. Thank you.